3 months passed, and the galaxy barely blinked. On Aethara Prime, the Galactic Council held its regular session on a gray morning beneath the flickering star map. Delegates filed into the Grand Senate Hall the way they always did, talking among themselves, making deals in whispered voices, trading favors and threats in equal measure. The chamber was full. Over 1,000 species were represented. The noise was enormous. But there was one chair that was empty. It sat in the far corner of the outermost ring, small and unpolished and unremarkable. There was no flag on the display board beside it. No name tag. No delegation behind it. The human seat was vacant. Vayleth So, the Rithani High Chancellor, noticed the absence during the opening roll call. She paused, her compound eyes scanning the empty corner, and then made a small clicking sound with her mandibles that her attendants recognized as mild irritation. "Note the absence of the human delegation," she said flatly. "Proceed." And they did. The session moved on to trade disputes and territorial negotiations, and a long, boring argument about mining rights in a nebula that no one particularly cared about. The empty chair sat in the corner like a forgotten piece of furniture. But beyond the Senate Hall, beyond the glittering towers of Aethara Prime, beyond the comfortable borders of council space, things were changing. It started with the relay stations. Humanity had built a vast network of communication relays across the outer veil over the past 4 decades. These relays were not glamorous. They were small, durable machines that floated in the void between stars, passing signals from one to the next, like a chain of lanterns in the dark. They allowed ships to navigate safely, traders to communicate with their ports, and governments to coordinate across impossible distances. Nobody had ever thanked humanity for building them. Nobody had ever asked how they worked. They simply existed, like gravity or light, and everyone used them without thinking. Now, one by one, the relays were going dark. Not destroyed, not attacked, simply powered down, locked with human encryption codes, and left floating silently in the black. Ships that had relied on these relays for years suddenly found themselves flying without navigation beacons. Trade convoys missed their windows. Emergency signals went unanswered because there was nothing to carry them. The Drekhari were the first to feel the pain. Torvan's border outposts, scattered across a dozen systems near the outer veil, had been quietly supplied through human logistics networks for over a decade. Human freight ships carried fuel, medicine, and food to these remote stations under contracts that nobody in the Drekhari military liked to talk about. It was embarrassing for a warrior species to depend on anyone, especially humans, so the arrangement had been kept quiet. Now, the supply ships stopped coming. The contracts had expired, and no new ones were offered. Torvan sent a formal demand to the Human Colonial Office on the border station of Threshold. The message bounced back with an automated reply. The office had been closed. The staff had gone home. There was no one to demand anything from. Torvan stared at the automated reply on his command screen for a long time. Then he crushed the screen with his fist and roared so loudly that his officers backed out of the room. Far away, in the cold silence of neutral space, Lucy Voss stood on the observation deck of the Pale Horse and watched her crew work. They were taking apart a human-built refueling station, piece by piece, with the slow and careful precision of people who understood the value of what they had built. The station had served thousands of alien ships over the years. It had been a waypoint, a rest stop, a place where travelers of every species could fill their tanks and patch their hulls and get a hot meal before heading back into the void. Humanity had built it, staffed it, and maintained it at their own expense for 23 years. Now they were bringing it home. Lucy was a tall woman with short dark hair and grease-stained hands that she never bothered to clean because they would just get dirty again. She had been chief engineer on the Pale Horse for 9 years, and she loved her ship the way some people love their children. She watched as her crew disconnected the station's power core, wrapped it in shielding, and loaded it into the cargo bay. A young crewman asked her if she felt bad about shutting the station down. Lucy thought about it for a moment. "We built it," she said simply. "We maintained it. We are taking it home. There is nothing to feel bad about." On Aethera Prime, the last human diplomat in Council space made her final appearance. Nora Bright was a woman of average height, with brown hair pulled back in a simple knot, and eyes that were calm and steady in a way that made people uncomfortable, without knowing why. She had replaced Danny Hale 3 months ago, not to continue his work, but to finish it. She entered the Senate Hall during an afternoon session, and requested a moment to address the chamber. Valeth So granted it, with a wave of her claw, expecting some sort of complaint or appeal. Nora walked to the central platform and stood there, alone, in front of 1,000 species. Her statement was short. Humanity is consolidating its operations to better serve its own citizens. We are grateful to the Galactic Council for its time and partnership over the past 47 years. We wish all member species continued peace and prosperity. She smiled politely, bowed her head, and walked off the platform. That was it. No anger, no accusations, no slamming of doors. Just a polite farewell and a quiet exit. In the silence that followed, most delegates returned to their conversations. A few exchanged glances. The Rathani archivist, who had deleted Ilesi's shipping flag 3 months ago, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. And Ilesi herself sat frozen in the upper observation gallery, where junior scholars were allowed to watch the proceedings. She watched Nora Bright walk out of the chamber, and felt that same cold unease she had felt months ago, except now it was sharper. Now it had teeth. She went straight to the council archives and began pulling records, every record she could find that mentioned humanity. She worked through the night, surrounded by data screens and old files, and the faint hum of the archive's cooling systems. What she found made her hands shake. Humanity had not simply occupied a minor seat in the Senate Hall. Humanity had built things everywhere. The relay network across the outer veil. 14 deep space refueling stations in neutral territory. Emergency medical protocols adopted by 36 species. Water purification systems on 11 colony worlds. Disaster relief coordination during the Selphine quake of 40 years ago, which had saved 2 million lives. Peacekeeping patrols along the most dangerous shipping lanes in the galaxy, flown at humanity's own expense, protecting ships that belonged to species who had never once said thank you. The list went on, page after page, year after year. A quiet, steady record of service that had been filed away and forgotten by everyone except the humans who had done the work. Ilesi gathered her findings into a report and requested an urgent meeting with High Chancellor Valeth So. The Chancellor agreed to see her for 5 minutes. Ilesi spoke quickly, showing the data, explaining the scope of what humanity had contributed and what the galaxy stood to lose. Valeth So listened with her claws folded and her compound eyes half closed. When Ilesi finished, the Chancellor was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The humans have chosen to leave. That is their right. The Council will adapt. It always does." She waved her claw in dismissal. Ilesi left the Chancellor's office and stood in the corridor outside, clutching her datapad to her chest, feeling like she was shouting into a void and hearing nothing come back. Meanwhile, on a lawless station deep in the outer veil, a pirate lord named Kreth sat in a dark room and listened to his scout's report. The human patrol ships were gone. The relay stations were dark. The refueling points were closed. The vast, empty stretches of space that had once been watched by human eyes and guarded by human ships were now wide open. Kreth leaned forward in his chair and smiled, showing rows of jagged, blackened teeth. "Send word to the others," he said. The shepherds have left. It is time to hunt. The distress signal came at midday, and it did not stop for 6 hours. An Alori civilian transport convoy, 12 ships carrying 60,000 people between colony worlds, had been hit in the outer veil. The attackers came fast and without warning, a fleet of pirate vessels flying no flag and answering no hails. They tore through the convoy's light escort in minutes. Then they boarded the transports one by one. By the time a nearby Rathani scout ship picked up the broken, repeating distress signal and relayed it to a Thera Prime, it was already over. 8 of the 12 ships had been captured. The other 4 had been destroyed when they tried to run. 60,000 Alori civilians, families with children, scholars, traders, ordinary people traveling between their homes, were dead or taken. Alessi heard the news in the archive, where she spent most of her time now. She set down her datapad, walked to the small washroom at the back of the office, closed the door, and sat on the floor with her wings folded tight against her body. She stayed there for a long time. She did not cry, because her species did not cry the way humans did. But she made a sound, a low, keening note, deep in her throat, that her people only made when grief was too large to carry. When she came out, she went back to work. There was nothing else to do. On Athara Prime, the council called an emergency session. The Senate Hall, which had been calm and orderly for decades, erupted into chaos. Delegates shouted over each other. Accusations flew like shrapnel. The Rathani blamed the Drekhari for destabilizing the outer veil with their aggressive territorial expansion. The Drekhari blamed the Rathani for hoarding military resources and refusing to patrol beyond their own borders. Smaller species huddled in their seats, too afraid to speak, watching the 2 most powerful factions in the galaxy tear at each other while the real enemy grew stronger in the dark. Vaylith So struck her speaking staff against the floor and demanded order. The chamber quieted, but the silence was thin and brittle, ready to crack at any moment. "We must replace the human relay network," Vaylith So announced. "We will commission a joint engineering project. Every member species will contribute resources and personnel." It sounded reasonable. It sounded like a plan. 12 species volunteered their best engineers, and work began within the week on a prototype relay station designed to replicate what the humans had built. The project collapsed in 23 days. The problem was not resources or labor. The problem was that no one understood how the human relays actually worked. For 40 years, humanity had offered its relay network freely to the galaxy. Ships of every species used the relays to navigate, communicate, and trade. The signals were clean and fast and reliable. Everyone had used them the way everyone uses air. You breathe it, you do not ask how it is made. But the human relays were not simple machines. They used an adaptive architecture that Danny Hale's engineers had developed over decades. A system that adjusted its own signal routing in real time based on gravitational shifts, solar radiation, and the movement of ships through nearby space. It was elegant and complex, and deeply, stubbornly human in its design. It was built to solve problems that no one else had even recognized as problems. Alessi discovered this when she dug into the technical archives. She found the original engineering specifications that humanity had filed with the Council when the relay network was first deployed. The documents had been stamped as received and then never opened. Not once in 40 years. She showed this to the engineering teams. They stared at the specifications and then at each other. One of them, a senior Rathani technician with 80 years of experience, said quietly, "We cannot build this. We do not even understand why it was built this way." While the council argued about relays, the outer veil burned. The pirates were only the beginning. Behind them, moving with the slow, deliberate patience of a predator that knows its prey has no escape, came the Vorok. They were a species from the far reaches of unexplored space, insectoid like the Rithani, but larger, harder, and completely without interest in diplomacy. For years, they had been probing the edges of the outer veil, testing defenses, looking for weakness. And for years, human patrol ships had met them at the border, again and again, pushing them back with a persistence that the Vorok had learned to respect. Now, the patrol ships were gone. The border was open, and the Vorok surged forward. Torvald learned this the hard way. He sent 2 full battle groups into the outer veil to deal with what he assumed was a simple pirate problem. His warriors were proud, well-armed, and experienced. They expected easy kills. They met the Vorok instead. The battle lasted 9 hours. When it was over, Torvald had lost both battle groups, 47 ships, 6,000 Drekhari warriors, gone. The Vorok did not even pause. They kept coming. Torvald sat alone in his command chamber aboard his flagship and stared at the casualty reports. His clawed hands trembled, not from fear, he told himself, but from a feeling he did not have a word for in his language. It was the feeling of learning that someone had been protecting you for years, and you had laughed at them for it. The ones he had mocked as soft meat playing guard, they had been standing between his people and this enemy for over a decade. He had never known. He had never asked. He had never thought to look. On Earth, Kevin Marsh sat in his underground room and watched the galaxy fall apart on his screens. He tracked the pirate raids, the Vorok advance, the Council's failed relay project, and the growing political fractures between species that had once pretended to be allies. He watched it all with a stillness that his staff found unnerving. One of his junior officers asked him if he felt satisfied. Kevin looked at her for a long moment. "No," he said. "I feel tired." The quiet step had never been about punishment. It had never been about revenge or proving a point or teaching the galaxy a lesson. It had been about survival. Humanity had been stretching itself thin for decades, pouring resources and lives into an alliance that gave nothing back. Human colonies on the frontier were underfunded. Human hospitals were short-staffed because doctors were deployed to alien worlds. Human ships were worn out from patrolling space that no one else would patrol. The quiet step was simply the decision to stop bleeding for people who did not notice the blood. But knowing that did not make it easier to watch the consequences. Far from Earth, Sam Caldwell sat in the cockpit of Rolling Stone, listening to galactic news on his ship's radio. The reports were bad and getting worse. Pirate attacks, refugee crises, military defeats, species turning on each other. The Alori convoy massacre played on a loop across every channel. Pesci, his young Alori co-pilot, sat beside him in silence. She had not spoken in 2 days. The people on those transports had been her people. Some of them may have been from her homeworld. After a long silence, she turned to Sam and asked the question that had been building behind her golden eyes since the day the orders changed. "Why did your people leave?" Sam was quiet for a while. He stared out at the stars, at the endless black that stretched in every direction, at the cold and indifferent universe that did not care who lived or died or fought or wept. "We kept knocking on the door," he said finally. "Nobody answered, so we went home." Pesci turned back to the stars and said nothing more. On Aethora Prime, Ilesi had finally been granted permission to address the full council. It had taken weeks of requests, appeals, and arguments with bureaucrats who saw her as a junior scholar overstepping her rank. But the crisis had loosened the old rules, and fear had a way of opening doors that pride had kept shut. She stood on the central platform where Danny Hale had stood months ago. The chamber was full, but this time the silence was different. It was not the silence of indifference. It was the silence of dread. Ilesi projected a single image onto the massive display above the platform. It was a star map of the galaxy, but it was different from the one on the ceiling. This map showed every system that had benefited from human infrastructure, human patrols, human aid, and human labor. There were thousands of points of light scattered across the map, like a constellation that no one had ever named. Then, one by one, the lights went out. Each one represented a system that had gone dark since humanity left. The map dimmed and dimmed until half the galaxy was shadow. The chamber was utterly silent. Ilesi looked out at the assembled delegates, at the 1,000 species who had ignored and dismissed and laughed at humanity for nearly 5 decades, and she spoke. "We did not lose an ally," she said. "We lost the foundation beneath our feet, and we never even looked down." 9 months had passed since Danny Hale walked out of the Senate Hall, and now the people who had never watched him leave were coming to find him. The Council's formal delegation departed Aethera Prime aboard the Chancellor's own flagship, a massive crystalline vessel that had not left the station world's orbit in over 30 years. The fact that Valeth So was traveling personally said more than any diplomatic message could. High Chancellors of the Rithani did not travel. They summoned, they commanded, they sat at the center of the web and let others come to them. For Valeth So to leave her seat of power and fly into human space was an act of humility that her species had not performed in living memory. Torvan came too. He stood on the observation deck of the Chancellor's ship, with his arms crossed and his jaw set, staring out at the passing stars with the expression of a man walking into a room where he knew he would be humiliated. His pride fought against every light year of distance, but his pride had lost 2 battle groups in the Outer Veil, and pride alone could not stop the Vorok. The delegation arrived at New Concord, a human border world that served as the gateway between human space and the rest of the galaxy. It was a modest planet by galactic standards, a world of green plains and blue oceans, and cities that were clean and functional without being grand. There were no crystalline towers here, no enormous Senate halls, just buildings that worked, streets that were maintained, and people who went about their lives with a quiet confidence that Torvan found deeply unsettling. Nora Bright met them at the spaceport. She wore a simple gray suit and carried a single datapad. There was no honor guard, no ceremony, no display of power. Just a woman standing on a landing pad, waiting calmly, with the wind blowing strands of brown hair across her face. Valeth So descended the ramp of her flagship with her full retinue of advisors and guards. She towered over Nora by nearly 4 feet, her insectoid body sharp and angular against the soft human sky. She expected, perhaps, that the humans would be grateful, that they would be relieved, that the sight of the High Chancellor of the Galactic Council arriving in person would shake something loose, some old loyalty or desperate hope. Nora shook Valeth So's offered claw with a firm, steady hand, and said, "Welcome to New Concord, Chancellor. I hope your journey was comfortable." That was all. Polite, professional, warm even. But there was no awe, no desperation, no hunger for approval. And in that moment, standing on a modest landing pad on a modest planet, Valeth So felt something she had not felt in a very long time. She felt small. The negotiations took place in a conference room in the New Concord Diplomatic Center. It was a pleasant room, with wide windows that looked out over a green valley. There was coffee and tea on the table, because humans always offered coffee and tea. Valeth So's advisors ran chemical scans on the beverages before allowing her to drink. Nora pretended not to notice. The Council's position was simple. They wanted humanity back. They wanted the relay stations reactivated, the patrol ships redeployed, the supply lines reopened, and the medical teams returned to alien worlds. They were willing to offer formal recognition, expanded Senate representation, and increased trade access. It was the most generous offer the Council had ever made to any species. Nora listened to it all with her hands folded on the table, and her expression calm and attentive. When the Council delegation finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she spoke. "We appreciate the offer," she said, "and we are open to future cooperation. But I want to be clear about something. Humanity will not return to its former role. We will not be the invisible framework that holds up a structure that does not acknowledge us. We will not send our engineers to build systems that other species use without thanks. We will not send our soldiers to die on borders that other species refuse to patrol. If we build something together, we build it as equals, or we do not build it at all." The room was very quiet. Torvald spoke for the first time since arriving. His voice was low and rough. "You would let the galaxy burn over a matter of pride?" Nora looked at him. "We let the galaxy burn for 47 years while we tried to put out the fires," she said. "Nobody noticed. We are not burning anything, Torvald. We simply stopped carrying the water." Torvald opened his mouth to respond, then closed it. He knew she was right, and the knowing sat in his chest like a stone. Later that afternoon, while the formal talks recessed, Valith So requested a private meeting with Nora. They sat together in a small room with a window that overlooked a garden where human children were playing. The Chancellor watched the children for a long time without speaking. Then she said something that her advisors would never hear. "I did not read the report," she said. "The one your ambassador presented. Danny Hale. I did not read it. I did not even open it." Nora nodded slowly. "He knew you would not." Valith So's compound eyes shifted, an involuntary expression that Nora had learned to recognize as something close to shame. "If I had read it," the Chancellor said, "would it have changed anything?" "It would have changed everything," Nora said quietly. While the diplomats talked, Torvald was given a tour of the human colony. She wanted him to see something that no strategic briefing or intelligence report could convey. He walked through the streets of New Concord's capital city with a human guide, a young man named Colby Pike, who worked in the colonial administration and seemed entirely unintimidated by the 8-foot reptilian warlord walking beside him. Colby pointed out schools, hospitals, parks, and research centers. He showed Torvald the colony's agricultural district, where fields of engineered crops stretched to the horizon under a warm sun. He showed him the shipyard, where human vessels were being built and repaired with steady, methodical efficiency. Torvald saw children running through a park, laughing and chasing each other beneath tall trees. He saw an old woman sitting on a bench, reading a book in the sunlight. He saw a group of young engineers arguing cheerfully over blueprints outside a workshop. He saw ordinary life, peaceful and secure and thriving, and it shook him in a way that losing 2 battle groups had not. He had always imagined humans as weak, struggling, desperate for the Council's approval and protection. He had pictured them as a small, frightened species clinging to the edges of a galaxy that was too big for them. Instead, he saw a civilization that had come home, redirected its energy inward, and flourished. They were not broken. They were not desperate. They were fine. That was the thing that hurt. They were fine without the Council. The Council was not fine without them. Back on Athara Prime, things were getting worse. 3 species had formally withdrawn from the Council, citing lack of security and broken promises. The Vorok had pushed deeper into former Council space, taking 2 more systems and enslaving their populations. Pirate activity in the Outer Veil had grown so severe that commercial shipping had all but stopped. Economies were collapsing. Refugee crises were spreading. The Grand Senate Hall, once a symbol of galactic unity, now echoed with the sounds of blame and fear. Ilesi worked without sleep. She drafted proposals for a new kind of alliance, one built not on hierarchy and power, but on the principles she had learned from studying human cooperative frameworks. Mutual respect, shared responsibility, equal representation, transparent communication. She called it the Concord Framework, named after the human world where she hoped it might one day be signed. On New Concord, Kevin Marsh arrived quietly aboard a military transport. He met Nora in her office late at night, and they talked for hours over cold coffee and stale sandwiches. Kevin was cautious. He had spent years watching humanity pour itself into an alliance that repaid generosity with contempt. He did not trust the Council's sudden change of heart. Every time we helped, he said, they forgot us the moment the crisis passed. We will go back. We will bleed for them again. And the moment the danger is over, they will push us back to the corner of the room. Nora was quiet for a moment. She looked out the window at the dark sky, at the distant stars that humans had once patrolled and protected at their own cost. Maybe, she said, you might be right. But we do not help because they remember Kevin. We help because of who we are. Kevin looked at her for a long time. He did not agree, not entirely, but he did not argue. 14,000 light-years away, on a quiet farming world at the heart of human space, Danny Hale sat on his porch and watched the sun go down. He had retired here after leaving Athara Prime, to a small house with a vegetable garden and a view of rolling green hills that stretched to the horizon. It was enough. A message arrived on his personal terminal. It was from Alessi. She had written him a letter, a real letter, not a diplomatic communication or a formal document, but a personal message from one person to another. In it, she apologized, not on behalf of the Council, because she had no authority to do that, but on behalf of herself. She told him that she had read his report, the one no one else had opened. She told him it was brilliant and clear and exactly right. She told him she was sorry that nobody had listened. Danny read the letter twice. Then he set down the datapad and sat for a long time, watching the last light fade from the sky, listening to the crickets in the grass and the wind in the trees and the quiet, ordinary sounds of the world at peace. He did not reply, not yet, but he kept the letter. 1 year after Danny Hale walked out of the Senate Hall, the Vorak came for Athara Prime. The attack fleet emerged from fold space in a wave so large that the Council's sensor arrays could not count them all at once. Thousands of ships, dark and sharp-edged and silent, spread across the sky like a stain. They did not hail. They did not demand surrender. They simply began advancing, slow and certain, toward the station world that had been the heart of galactic civilization for 10,000 years. The remaining Council fleets scrambled to form a defensive line. 700 ships from a dozen species arranged themselves between the Vorak and Athara Prime. But the line was thin and poorly coordinated. Species that had never fought together struggled to communicate. Commands were issued in different languages, on different frequencies, using different tactical doctrines. Ships collided with each other, trying to form up. Gaps appeared in the formation that no one could fill. Valith So stood in the Council Command Center, a vast room buried deep beneath the surface of Athara Prime, and watched her world's defenses crumble on the tactical display. She had lived for over 3 centuries. She had seen crises and wars and plagues, but she had never seen anything like this. The Vorak moved with a coordination that was terrifying, each ship acting in perfect harmony with the others, like the fingers of a single enormous hand closing around its prey. The Chancellor turned to her communications officer. "Open a channel to human space," she said. The officer hesitated. "What should I say, Chancellor?" Valith So was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Tell them what is happening. Not as a request, not as a demand. Simply tell them what is happening. Let them know that someone was here. That we tried. The transmission went out across every frequency, unencrypted, unfiltered, a raw signal flung into the void. It carried the tactical data, the fleet positions, the Vorok numbers, and the Chancellor's own voice, thin and clicking and stripped of all pride. It was not a call for help. It was a record, a testament, the last words of a civilization that had just realized, far too late, how small it truly was. The signal reached human space in seconds, bounced through relay stations that had been reactivated weeks ago during the negotiations on New Concord, and arrived on every human ship, colony, outpost, and station simultaneously. There was no order from command, no grand speech from a president or admiral, no dramatic moment where a leader stood before a crowd and said something stirring. That was not how it happened. That was not how humans worked. And bigger. Sam Caldwell was hauling cargo between two colony worlds when the signal came through. He listened to it in his cockpit, alone except for Pesci, who sat beside him with her feathered hands pressed flat against the console, trembling. When the transmission ended, Sam was still for a long moment. Then he reached for the navigation controls and changed course. He did not call anyone. He did not ask permission. He simply turned his ship toward Aethera Prime and pushed the engines to full. Pesci looked at him. "You are going back," she said. It was not a question. "Yeah," Sam said, "I am." On the Pale Horse, Lucy Voss was in the engine room when the signal arrived. She listened to it over the ship's intercom while her hands kept working on the turbine she was repairing, tightening a bolt, checking a seal, doing the small practical things that kept the universe running. When the transmission ended, she wiped her hands on her pants, walked to the ship's communication system, and sent a single message to every member of her crew who was on shore leave. The message was 2 words: saddle up. They came back, all of them, within the hour. Kevin Marsh received the signal in his underground room on Earth. He watched the tactical data scroll across his screens, and his mind began doing what it always did. Calculating, planning, seeing patterns in the chaos. He pulled up the positions of every human ship within range of Aethera Prime, and began drawing up a battle plan. No one had ordered him to do this. No one needed to. Nora Bright was still on New Concord when the signal arrived. She listened to Valet So's voice, that thin, proud voice now stripped bare and raw, and she closed her eyes for just a moment. Then she opened them, picked up her communicator, and contacted the Chancellor on a private channel. "Not because you asked. Not because we owe you. Because this is what humans do." The human fleet that arrived at Aethera Prime was not a grand armada. It was not a wall of gleaming warships stretching from horizon to horizon. It was something stranger, and in its own way, more frightening. It was everything humanity had. Warships came, yes, sleek and fast and well-armed. But beside them flew cargo haulers and freight ships, their holds emptied and their hulls reinforced with whatever plating their crews could weld on in the hours of travel. Medical vessels came, staffed with doctors and nurses who had volunteered the moment the signal reached them. Research ships came, their scientists already working on ways to disrupt Vorok communications. Civilian transports came, piloted by retired captains and young volunteers and ordinary people who had never fired a weapon in their lives, but who could fly a ship and were willing to put themselves between the enemy and the innocent. They arrived in a ragged, mismatched wave, and the Vorok paused, not out of fear, perhaps, but out of something close to confusion. Their intelligence had told them that the humans were gone, that this region of space was undefended, that the soft, quiet species that had once patrolled these borders had retreated to its own territory and would not return. The humans had not come back as conquerors or saviors. They had come back as themselves, practical, stubborn, and unwilling to stand by while people died. Kevin Marsh coordinated the defense from a command ship at the center of the human formation. He did something that no one in the history of the Galactic Council had ever managed. He wove the human ships and the remaining council ships into a single cohesive force. He assigned frequencies, established communication protocols, and gave clear, simple orders that could be understood across species and languages. It was not elegant. It was not pretty. But it worked. The battle for Athara Prime lasted 14 hours. Lucy Voss led an engineering team in a shuttle directly to a disabled Council defense platform, a massive orbital weapons station that had been knocked offline in the first wave of the attack. While Vorok fighters screamed past and explosions lit up the void around her, Lucy and her crew cut through the station's hull, bypassed the damaged systems, and jury-rigged the main weapon back online using parts from their own shuttle. When the weapon fired, it carved a hole through the center of a Vorak formation that had been closing on Athara Prime's northern hemisphere. Sam Caldwell flew Rolling Stone into the middle of an evacuation zone where a lorry civilian ships were trying to escape the battle. A Vorak destroyer was bearing down on them, and there was nothing between the destroyer and the civilians except empty space. Sam put his freighter in that empty space. He positioned Rolling Stone directly in the destroyer's path. Shields forward, engines locked. The destroyer's weapons hit his ship again and again, tearing through hull plating and blowing out systems deck by deck. But Sam held position until the civilian ships cleared the zone. When it was over, Rolling Stone was barely holding together, venting atmosphere from a dozen breaches. But Sam was alive, and so were the people behind him. Pesci, who had stayed aboard against Sam's orders, pulled him from the wreckage of the cockpit with her small, feathered hands and told him he was the most stubborn creature she had ever met. Sam laughed, coughed blood, and said, "That is the nicest thing anyone has ever said to me." The Vorak were pushed back, not destroyed. The narration does not pretend that one battle ended a war. But they were broken, scattered, forced to retreat into the outer veil to regroup. The cost was high. Human ships were damaged and destroyed. Lives were lost, good lives, brave lives, lives that would be mourned in quiet ceremonies on quiet worlds for years to come. But the line held. Athara Prime survived. In the aftermath, the Council reconvened in the battered Senate Hall. The crystalline pillars were cracked. The star map on the ceiling flickered. Debris floated past the windows. But the delegates were there, all of them, seated in their places, silent and shaken and waiting. Veilith So stood on the central platform. In her claws, she held a datapad containing a document that was 1 year old. Danny Hale's report, the one she had never read. She read it now, aloud, to the full assembly. Every word, every warning, every projection that had come true, exactly as written. When she finished, the chamber was silent. "We were warned," Veilith So said. "We did not listen. One species saw what we could not, and when we dismissed them, they did not rage, they did not threaten, they simply left. And in leaving, they showed us exactly how much we had failed to see." She paused. Her compound eyes swept the chamber. "I will not ask for forgiveness," she said. "Forgiveness is not owed to those who chose not to see. But I will ask for a new beginning, not on the old terms, on theirs." Alessi was appointed as the Council's new liaison to humanity. Her first act was to formally propose the Concord Framework, the new alliance structure she had built from the ground up, based on everything she had learned from studying human history and human values. Equal seats, shared burdens, transparent decisions, no species above another. The vote was unanimous. On his quiet farming world, Danny Hale finally sat down and wrote his reply to Alessi's letter. He had kept it for months, reading it again on certain evenings when the sky was clear and the world was still. His reply was short. "Thank you for listening. That was all we ever wanted." And on Athara Prime, in a new council chamber built from the wreckage of the old one, a human seat sat at the center of the table. Not in the back, not in the corner. At the center, where it could see and be seen, where its voice would carry and its presence would be felt. Nora Bright walked into that chamber on the first day of the new council. She wore the same simple gray suit she always wore. She carried the same datapad. She sat down in the human seat, opened her folder, looked around the table at the faces of 1,000 species who had finally learned what it cost to ignore the quiet ones, and she said, "Shall we get to work?" The chamber stirred. Delegates leaned forward. Voices murmured in agreement. And somewhere out among the stars, in the vast and endless dark, the relays hummed back to life, one by one, like lanterns being lit along a road that led at last toward home. They had left quietly, and in the silence, the galaxy finally learned to hear. Danny Hale sat alone in the far corner of the Grand Senate Hall on Athara Prime, the kind of corner where the lights flickered slightly and the cleaning drones never quite reached. His chair was the smallest in the chamber. It always had been. 47 years humanity had held a seat on the Galactic Council, and in all that time, the chair had never been replaced, never moved closer to the center, never given a better light overhead. Danny had stopped noticing these things years ago, or maybe he had simply stopped caring. The Senate Hall itself was enormous. Crystalline pillars rose hundreds of feet into a domed ceiling that displayed a live star map of the known galaxy. Over 1,000 species held seats here, each delegation arranged in tiered rings that circled a central speaking platform. The innermost rings belonged to the founding species, the ones who had shaped the council millennia ago. The Raifani, an insectoid race of towering, sharp-limbed creatures, held the highest seats. The Drekhari, massive reptilian warriors with scaled hides and deep, rumbling voices, sat just behind them. Humanity sat in the outermost ring, 3 rows from the back wall, wedged between a fungal collective that communicated through spore clouds, and a silicon-based species that had not spoken in 11 years. Danny opened his folder and looked at the report one last time. 6 months of work, hundreds of pages of data, intelligence summaries, and projections. He had documented the growing instability in the outer veil, a lawless stretch of space that bordered Council territory. Piracy had increased by 300% in 2 years. Slave trading was flourishing. 3 minor species had already lost their homeworlds to raiders, and a new threat, a species called the Vorok, was massing along the far edge of the veil in numbers that made Danny's stomach turn. He had the evidence. He had a clear, actionable proposal for a joint intervention that could stop the bleeding before it became a hemorrhage. He stood when his turn came. It took 4 hours of waiting. When his name was finally called, it was mispronounced, as it always was. Danny walked to the central platform and presented his motion. He spoke clearly and calmly. He laid out the facts without drama. He showed the maps, the numbers, the projections. He explained that the human patrol ships currently operating in the outer veil were stretched too thin, that they could not hold the region alone, and that a joint council force could stabilize the area within months. The chamber was mostly silent while he spoke, but it was not the silence of attention. It was the silence of indifference. Delegates checked their personal devices. The Rithani Chancellor, Valith So, cleaned her front claws with slow, deliberate strokes. The Drekhari representative, a warlord named Torvan, leaned back in his massive chair and closed his eyes. When Danny finished, Valith So spoke without looking up from her claws. "The motion is noted. It will be tabled for future review." Her voice was thin and clicking, like dry sticks breaking. Torvan opened one eye and let out a low, rumbling laugh that echoed through the chamber. Perhaps the humans should focus on learning to walk among the stars before they try to tell us where to step, he said. Several delegations chuckled. A few did not bother to hide their amusement. Danny stood on the platform for a moment longer. He looked out across the vast chamber, at the 1,000 species who had not listened, at the towering pillars and the glittering star map, and the empty, echoing grandeur of a place that had decided long ago that his kind did not matter. He did not argue. He did not raise his voice. He simply closed his folder, nodded once, and walked back to his small chair in the far corner. He gathered his things quietly. Then he stood and walked out of the Senate Hall, through a side door that led to a narrow corridor used mostly by maintenance staff. No one watched him leave. Back aboard the human diplomatic frigate docked at the station, Danny sat in his quarters and opened a secure communication channel to Earth. The encryption was military grade. The connection took 11 seconds to establish across the vast distance. When the line opened, Danny spoke one sentence to the person on the other end. They are not going to listen. On Earth, 14,000 light-years away, a man named Kevin Marsh sat in a windowless room buried deep beneath a mountain range. The room was plain and cold, filled with screens showing data feeds from across human space. Kevin was not a politician. He was a strategist, the kind of person who planned for outcomes that no one wanted to think about. He had been waiting for Danny's call, not hoping for it, but expecting it. He had known for years that this moment would come. He had watched every ignored report, every dismissed proposal, every quiet humiliation that humanity had endured in that grand Senate Hall. And he had prepared. Kevin opened a file on his terminal. It was labeled Quiet Step. He read through the first page one more time, though he knew every word by heart. Then he entered his authorization code and activated Phase 1. Phase 1 was simple. There were no announcements, no threats, no ultimatums, no angry speeches broadcast across the galaxy. Human trade convoys began quietly rerouting away from Council-aligned systems. Contracts with alien governments were allowed to expire without renewal. Human freight captains across the galaxy received new orders through encrypted channels, redirecting their cargo to human-only colonial routes. Sam Caldwell was one of those captains. He was a retired military man who had spent the last decade hauling freight between the stars in a battered cargo ship he had named Rolling Stone. When the new orders came through, Sam read them twice, leaned back in his pilot's chair, and scratched his gray beard. His Alori co-pilot, a young avian trader named Pesci, asked what the message said. Sam told her they were changing course. She asked why. Sam did not answer. Across the galaxy, small changes began happening. A human medical supply depot on a neutral station reduced its hours, then closed entirely. A human-run communication relay on the border of Drekari space went into maintenance mode and never came back online. A team of human engineers working on a water purification project for a Rithani colony world packed their tools and boarded a shuttle home. None of these things made the news. None of them triggered any alarms. They were small, quiet, ordinary. On Athara Prime, in a cluttered office deep within the council archives, a young Alori scholar named Alessi noticed something odd in the daily shipping logs. There was a gap. A pattern of absences that did not fit any known schedule. Human ships were disappearing from routes they had flown for decades. She flagged the anomaly in the system and sent a note to her supervisor, a senior Rithani archivist who had held the position for over a century. Her supervisor read the note, considered it for approximately 2 seconds, and deleted the flag. Alessi stared at her screen, watching the deletion confirmation blink once and then vanish. She looked out her small window at the glittering spires of Athara Prime, and felt, for the first time, a strange and sourceless unease, like the feeling before a storm, when the air goes still and the birds stop singing. Something was changing. She could feel it. But she did not yet have the words for what it was. And in the Grand Senate Hall, Danny Hale's empty chair sat in the far corner, gathering dust. No one noticed it was empty. No one noticed anything at all.